Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another DDR5 overclock with Ryzen 7000, this time with some Samsung-based memory sticks. So I bought a set of Corsair Vengeance 5600, 36, 36, 36, 76, 1.25 volt XMP profile memory sticks. These use Samsung 16 gigabit B die. It has nothing in common with 8 gigabit DDR4 B die, because the die number, like the die letter revisions thing, literally just means how many revisions of a memory chip there have been, or how many revisions of a certain density of memory chip they have been. Samsung 16 gigabit B die is completely different from Samsung 8 gigabit DDR4 B die. Okay, they are not even remotely related to each other. The fact that they both are technically like the revision B memory chips doesn't mean anything. Okay? Actually, the only thing it means is that apparently Samsung had 3 other design. Actually, no, it means that this is Samsung's 3rd design of a 16 gigabit DDR5 memory chip. Now, that might make you think, oh, these must be relatively new. They aren't. They're actually all, like, these have been available since the Z690 motherboard days. Like, these are the only, or like, these are Samsung's first 16 gigabit DDR5 chip that was like actually available to consumers, as far as I know. So yeah, apparently they had like an A die and an M die, which like didn't work well enough. So we never saw them at retail. Anyway, yeah, so this stuff has been around for ages, but I've only now bought a kit because getting review samples of this stuff is basically impossible. Mostly because it's just kind of worse than Hynix memory chips. Not by a huge amount, but it is worse. And it's also not significantly cheaper, right? Because when it comes to actual like bulk pricing for memory chips, they all kind of cost the same. So regardless of how good they are at overclocking, the memory chips in and of themselves don't tend to be significantly cheaper or anything. So yeah, you like getting review samples of a memory chip that is not the best is kind of difficult, because manufacturers don't want to sample things that aren't, great. But anyway, yeah, so I bought this kit. Big thank you to my supporters for making the purchase possible. For the rest of the system, I'm using the Ryzen 9 7900X. That was provided by AMD, and for the motherboard, I'm using a Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master, which was provided by Gigabyte. Anyway, let's take a look at what I've actually managed to set up with these memory sticks here. So I've run like all of the tests and a lot of Y-Cruncher. And the reasoning for this is that because these Samsung memory chips don't clock that high, the thing that I kind of wanted to mess around with was trying to push the Infinity Fabric clock really high. Because with Ryzen 7000, if you want to get better memory, like lower memory latency, you just push the Infinity Fabric as high as it goes, basically. It's not like the older Ryzen chips where you had the 1-to-1 ratio and you had to actually worry about keeping your Infinity Fabric synchronized with your memory controller. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that with Ryzen 7000 because the memory controller runs at clocks that the Infinity Fabric simply cannot reach. Or you can run the memory controller at clocks that are way below the Infinity Fabric clock, and you're better off running the Infinity Fabric at higher clocks than the memory controller. Anyway, sort of like what you would do with Ryzen 5000 in the 2-to-1 mode if you actually were using 2-to-1 mode. There are like certain benchmarking scenarios where 2-to-1 mode makes sense. But yeah, with Ryzen 7000, the Infinity Fabric is permanently desynchronized from the memory controller because the clocks that they run at are not even, like, there's no way to synchronize the two of them, right? The Infinity Fabric clocks around 2-ish gigahertz, and the memory controller runs at around 3. So, yeah. Or even if you're using, like, DDR5 4800, the memory controller is still at, like, 2.4 gigahertz, which the Infinity Fabric simply doesn't do. But anyway, yeah, so I wanted to mess around with this higher Infinity Fabric clock because the memory clock is relatively low, and the thing with the Infinity Fabric that I've sort of tested for recently is that it actually scales negatively with SoC voltage. So if you go, like, if you keep raising the SoC voltage, your max Infinity Fabric clock will tend to come down. At least on some CPUs. I'm not sure if this applies to all CPUs, but I've noticed this effect on several chips at this point where it's like if you raise the SoC voltage, the Infinity Fabric gets less stable. So at lower memory clocks, this isn't really a problem because at low memory clocks, you don't need a lot of SoC voltage. So if we're at DDR5 6000 with just 1.2 volts on the SoC, in theory, it should be possible to run a really high Infinity Fabric clock. And so that's why I have 47,000 seconds of Y-Cruncher. There's also 100 loops of LinPack. There are absolutely no errors in hardware info, not that that really means anything, because like I've shown in a recent video, the Infinity Fabric on Ryzen 7000 has error correction, and for whatever reason, I can't get it to display errors. Like, I know there's an option in the BIOS for, like, advanced error reporting. I tried turning that on. That didn't really seem to do anything. It might also be that, like, the OS that I'm using just is somehow broken, which wouldn't really surprise me, considering that I don't really take particularly great care of my Windows installs that I use for, like, testing things, because I break them on a regular basis. But, yeah, anyway, so the fact that there's no errors doesn't really mean that much, but I have had the system hooked up to the oscilloscope the entire time, and I didn't really notice any obvious, like, error correction going on while Y-Cruncher or LinPack were running, and the LinPack performance looks about right considering the operating temperatures that the CPU has been at, right? Like, we have 639 right at the start, which is, like, that's basically as fast as the 7900X gets with these memory settings. And then it dropped off after that because the temperature went up. Yeah, so it's on a 240 millimeter AIO. Also, the ambient air temperature, like it's the weather's been a lot warmer here in the UK recently, and so the ambient temperature's gone up, and so that's eaten into the LinPack performance a bit. But yeah, like I'm not seeing any like weird performance issues or yeah, any indication that the ECC is actually currently kicking in. So the 2166 on the Infinity Fabric does seem to be stable right now. For the timings, we've got cast latency 30, which is not that low, but unless I get more... The thing is, Gigabyte has... Well, the BIOS on the board right now that I'm using doesn't work at high memory voltages again, so that's great. And consequently, I can't lower the time, like I can't push the cast latency any lower than 30 because that would require more voltage than what the board is willing to train with. Anyway, but yeah, well, also we'll just look at the timings in the actual BIOS because that'll be easier. But like we have like the sort of the Samsung thing is like you can push your TRCD really low, and also you can potentially push your TRP pretty low. So like TRP's at 32, TRCD's at 33. We'll go into more detail on the timings when we actually get to the BIOS. But anyway, yeah, so sort of the little like side project of this Samsung DDR5 overclock was pushing the Infinity Fabric really high. Now, like LinPack ran without any errors, Y-Cruncher ran without any errors. Incidentally, I figured out you can actually pause Y-Cruncher if you press escape. It'll pause after the previous loop. So that's why it doesn't say like testing complete. It's because it's actually paused. If you had pressed the enter key, then it starts running again. But anyway, I also ran test mem5, just an hour and 46 minutes. That didn't find any errors. And then HCI mem test for almost 2000%. Also didn't find any errors. So yeah, this is quite stable. In terms of performance, this gets a... Where's my pi prime? Yeah. This gets a 9.589 in pi prime with the 7900X at stock. This is very quick for this 7900X with just like stock settings. And the thing is, pi prime is insanely latency sensitive. Like this is just way more latency sensitive than basically any other memory benchmark that I'm aware of. And so this really benefits a lot from the like extra Infinity Fabric clock, also the really low primary timings, and it's less harmed by the fact that like Samsung DDR5 really doesn't do super low tertiaries or secondaries or really anything other than primaries. Like, yeah, the sub timings for Samsung memory are honestly like they're kind of bad. But like, well, from a latency perspective, it's not a disaster, right? And I also ran IDA, and yeah, we get 55 nanoseconds of latency. The actual like bandwidths aren't great, but that's also partially because we're just a DDR5 6000. I do think I have gear down mode disabled. No, gear down mode is still on, but power down mode is disabled. But yeah, 55 nanoseconds, which isn't the lowest latency I've seen, but at DDR5 6000, I'm not entirely certain that it's possible to go any lower than this, as your memory latency obviously comes down with your memory controller clock, which is why you always want to clock the memory as high as possible, at least in general. With Ryzen, it's well, again, there's that whole trade-off of like high memory clocks require high SoC voltage. High SoC voltage destabilizes high infinity fabric clocks on some CPUs. I think it's probably most CPUs. Yeah. Anyway, like from a latency perspective, the performance is solid. From a bandwidth perspective, it's not that great. But at the same time, it's not like massively behind the Hynix memory stick. So if you end up with a Samsung memory kit and you have a Ryzen system, it's not the end of the world in terms of performance. But at the same time, I wouldn't go and specifically search for Samsung-based memory kits because they basically cost the same as Hynix memory kits, and the Hynix memory kits are a bit better. Well, actually, I think for PipePrime, the Samsung memory kit might actually have an advantage, but for general purpose, you actually want Hynix kits because they'll do like lower TRFC, lower TRC, lower, well, slightly lower tertiaries. Some of the other secondaries can also go lower, so yeah. Anyway, so performance-wise, it's not a complete disaster. It's not like on Intel where because you're massively behind on clocks, you just get destroyed by Hynix memory chips. So that's kind of neat. But anyway, I guess at this point we'll go into the BIOS, which means I've committed to this video at this point. Yay! Anyway, yeah, so it passes all the tests. Performance is, I'd say, pretty okay. The fun thing with the Samsung memory chips is like a lot of the overclocking devolves into don't touch that timing, it doesn't like it. So, yeah. Anyway, I have fast boot disabled, so this will take... Or, well, not fast boot. I have memory context restore disabled. Because it can cause some weird instability issues over time with memory overclocks. So, yeah. Though, Gigabyte's boards, like, retrain the memory really, really quickly these days. Even with the memory context in it, like, the memory context restore disabled, they still train really quickly. So, anyway, here we are in the BIOS. SoC voltage is at 1.2 volts. This actually seems to be the like ideal voltage for the Infinity Fabric on this CPU. Because, yeah, like if I try to push, say, 22... Well, I'll probably do a separate video about that. But yeah, with this CPU, 1.2 volts SoC seems to actually be optimal. Also, the BIOS version that I'm on currently is F11A, which is the 1.0.7A AGSA. Anyway, so 1.2 volts SoC, so well below the 1.3 volt limit. Also on this BIOS version, you actually cannot set the SoC voltage above 1.3 volts. Yeah, it cannot be done. Which, yeah, I think I preferred Gigabyte's previous approach, or where they gave you a warning if you wanted to go above 1.3 volts, but I guess this probably isn't. I would assume that this is probably from AMD. That SoC voltage restriction. Anyway, for VDDI-O MEM, we're at 1.25 volts. For VDDQ, 1.25 volts. These are basically like signaling voltages for the memory controller and the memory sticks. Well, this is the like signaling voltage from the memory stick, so the I/O portion of the memory stick, and this is the I/O of like the memory controller. Yeah, it should be the I/O of the memory controller. So these are basic, like, so VDDI-O and VDDQ are basically the voltage that the memory controller and the memory sticks use to talk to each other. In most scenarios, they should probably be the same voltage. Though you might find, well, kind of depends on the motherboard and BIOS version, I think. But I've mostly been using them both at the same voltage, and that seems to work for me just fine. There's also really, like, you could arguably run the VDDI-O lower, but I'm not sure that there's any reason to actually do that from, like, a CPU longevity perspective or anything like that. Anyway, then we have the DDR VDD voltage. This is actually just, like, an internal voltage for the memory chips. Technically speaking, the memory controller, like the CPU's memory controller, doesn't really see VDDQ because it's not like the memory chip is going to be sending power to the memory controller. It's just sending signals, so, you know, there's not going to be that much energy behind them. But anyway, so this is like an internal voltage for the memory chips. This voltage is what basically dictates your memory timings. Like, this voltage pretty much alone dictates your memory timings. It can also affect the memory clock. The VDDQ definitely affects the memory clock. Anyway, VPP is just at stock because it really doesn't do anything. For advanced voltage settings, I have VDD18 at, well, that's actually set back to stock at 1.8 volts. I was testing out if raising that could, like, help the Infinity Fabric stability. It doesn't. That was a thing for Ryzen 5000. It isn't with 7000, which makes sense. Different CPUs, different behaviors. Anyway, VDDG CCD voltage at 1050, and then the IOD voltage at 950. The board will typically actually default to 950 on its own, but 1050, 950 in my experience sort of gets the best stability with this CPU for high Infinity Fabric clocks. So that's what's going on there. And that's actually it in terms of voltages, because, yeah, everything else is on auto. The CPU is bone stock. Pretty sure I don't have PBO enabled. Yeah, CPU is just completely stock. Anyway, though, it is worth noting, so in AMD CBS, what I have done is we have TSME disabled. This helps lower your memory latency a bit. I think the BIOS actually disables this on auto, like automatically, but just in case it doesn't, I disabled it manually. There's one, oh yeah, and then there's the memory features. Here's your memory context restore. I have that disabled because it can occasionally cause issues with, well, it can cause issues with power down, and it can also cause just issues on its own, in my experience, where, like, sometimes if you're, because what it does is it tells the memory controller to, like, use past memory training configurations, which in theory should always work just fine, but sometimes it doesn't, and then you end up with a system that, like, randomly loses stability after a random number of reboots, which is quite annoying. So yeah, and then other than that, I also have the data fabric C states disabled, which is just to try help stability of the Infinity Fabric, because if it's not changing clocks, then it's less likely to have stability issues. As generally speaking, like, going from one frequency to another frequency tends to cause stability issues, like, in and of itself, depending on how exactly the circuitry is implemented. So anyway, yeah. Now let's take a look at the actual memory timings. Oh yeah, so I do have power down mode disabled, and so what power down mode is it's basically just a sleep state for the I/O portion of the memory chip. It saves negligible amounts of power in desktop applications. Quite frankly, I have no idea why any desktop CPU ever uses this, because it doesn't make any sense. It kind of makes sense for server applications where you have many, many, many ranks of memory. You can, like, put the I/O portion of your unused ranks to sleep, and it makes sense for low power devices, because low power devices have CPUs that pull, like, single-digit watts, and, you know, your memory stick using a fraction of a watt starts actually being a problem. But this is a desktop system. The CPU pulls like 10 watts at idle, if not more than that. I have no idea why saving a fraction of a watt on the memory sticks is a, you know, thing that the memory controller needs to be doing. But the thing is, the power down mode does have a slight latency penalty to it, because you basically need to wake up the memory chip if this is enabled. So you want to disable this to improve your memory latency. Because, yeah, basically, if the memory is idle for long enough, the memory controller will put the memory rank to sleep, and then it'll have to wake it up again. And there's a delay for doing actually both of those things. There's a delay putting the memory stick to sleep, like putting the rank to sleep, waking the rank up, and so that just adds a bunch of latency, and it saves for, like, I can understand why it exists for, like, laptops, phones, you know, various portable devices. I can totally understand why. Desktop CPUs, no idea. I can also understand in servers where you might have like 16 ranks of memory on a memory. Actually, I don't think 16 is possible. 8 ranks of memory is certainly possible on a channel. So being able to put like 7 of those ranks to sleep, that makes sense. But this is a 7900X. It's not a server CPU. Anyway, so yeah, now let's take a look at the actual timings. So the neat thing with Samsung memory sticks is that your primary timings can go really low, or at least the first 3 of them can go really low, because the main thing I've sort of figured out with these Samsung chips is that they don't like it when you lower the TRC. They really don't like it if you touch the TRFC timing. They absolutely hate that. Even at 777, like the default is 824. If you set this to 777, the stability goes just out the window. Just it completely craters. There is no headroom on the refresh cycle of these memory chips, which is yeah, that is quite something. Like apparently the Jade like well, the JEDEC spec exists for a reason, and these memory chips are that reason. Because they barely meet it. Because actually, the fun fact, your motherboard, if you just leave a lot of timings on auto, most motherboards will take the JEDEC spec and they will just scale it up to whatever memory speed you're at. So at like 4800, the TRFC will be JEDEC spec. At 6000, it'll be JEDEC spec multiplied by the difference between 4800 and 6000 as a ratio, not as a literal like subtraction. Anyway, yeah, so touching TRFC with Samsung memory chips, bad idea. Don't do that. TRFC2 and same bank are not used by the AMD memory controller currently, so you don't have to worry about those either. And that, like, so the kind of funny thing with these Samsung memory chips is they're very easy to tune because there's a lot of stuff you just can't do anything with. Which is these 3 timings right here. Now, refresh interval, I did manage to max that out, so that's good, because that significantly lowers the memory latency, even if your TRFC is absolutely massive. In fact, the ability to max out the TREFI to like 65,000 basically negates the fact that TRFC is absolutely terrible. Because you, like, the thing is, TRFC is how long the memory chip refreshes for. Refresh TREF is, or TREFI if this was an Intel CPU, that controls how long the CPU goes between refresh commands, right? So if you just don't send refresh commands very often, the fact that each of those refreshes takes forever matters a lot less. So yeah, that's what's going on there. And I've had no issues with running TREFI 65,000 on these memory sticks whatsoever. Also, I'm not even running a fan on them, right? Like they're just like they've just been sitting like this. And the ambient temperature has gotten as high as 27 degrees Celsius. I mean, technically there is some incidental airflow from the radiator that's like sitting off to the side of the motherboard, but there's no like fan directly on top of the memory sticks. So yeah, you should be able to do this even in a case, unless your GPU gets very hot, which I guess if you have a 4090 is a realistic concern, or a 7900 XT. Anyway, right, so primary timings, these are minimized. These don't go any lower at this point. Actually, yeah, they literally do not go any lower at this point unless I had more voltage. But the thing is, and by more voltage, I mean, like, potentially the primaries would go lower if I could run, say, 1.6 volts of VDD. But the issue is that on the F11A BIOS, and I think actually the F10 BIOS was doing this as well, if you go above like 1.4 volt, like 1.43 volts, the motherboard just refuses to train, which seems to be some kind of issue with like the memory controller configuration. So like the might be terminations, might be something that we don't even have access to in the BIOS. Basically, once you set the memory voltage really high, the motherboard just refuses to post. It just goes from 15 to C5. So yeah, that's fun. I've run into this issue with Gigabyte boards in the past. On some boards, it's not, like, I don't know, maybe it'll get fixed in a BIOS update. Anyway, yeah, so I wish the primaries could go lower, but with the voltage restrictions that we have here, 30, 33, 32 is the limit. Though 33 and 32 for the TRCD and TRP are really, really low. I think some of the best Hynix kits that I've like heard of / seen do like 35 at 6000 for TRCD, and that's with like a lot of voltage. So yeah, being able to do 33 at 1.43 volts is actually really cool. Now the bad news is that, good news, TRCD is pretty important, like arguably more important for performance than cast latency. And it pretty linearly, like it reduces your latency just the same as like cast latency. Like going from TRCD, say 36 to 34 is the same thing as going from a cast latency of 30 to 28. Yeah, mostly the same thing as going from a cast latency of 30 to 28. Though, depending on the scenario, the TRCD is actually more impactful for overall performance because cast latency is a timing that the memory controller can hide with clever scheduling, and TRCD can also be hidden with clever scheduling, but it's a lot more difficult because TRCD is a lot more specific in terms of it's not, no, you can't really queue up TRCD as much as you can cast latency. So, yeah, anyway, so the low TRCD is actually really cool, but then everything else is just a complete disaster. TRAS is at 80, mostly to match the TRC, because, yeah, the TRC on these sticks really doesn't like going low. I tried it at 96, it, like, already stops being stable, so, yeah, that's great. Admittedly, I didn't try, like, a whole range of TRC values, but, like, if you're not going to drop the timing by more than 10%, you may as well not bother, as far as I'm concerned, because any one timing is not going to make that much of a difference on its own. So, yeah, like, maybe TRC would do 100 or something, but that's not going to drastically affect performance. Anyway, then we have TWR, which is at 48. TREFI, which is maxed out. TWR doesn't go below 48. That's a restriction of the AMD memory controller. Then we have RTP, which is at 16. I didn't check if lower values of RTP are possible. They probably are, but RTP is not a timing that, like, drastically impacts performance. So, yeah, I don't really feel like dealing with more stress testing just to lower RTP by a couple notches. The TRRDs are both at 4, which is pretty cool. So that's neat. These don't go any lower than that. TFall's at 20. That also doesn't go any lower than that. And these are like memory controller timing restrictions. Like the memory controller does not support a TRRD of less than 4. So this is as low as it goes from like a implementation limitation. And actually with DDR5, your TRRD being less than 8 already has very, like, arguably negligible benefits, because it turns into a, like, more of a scheduling benefit rather than an actual, like, immediate like it doesn't directly lead into, because your burst length is 8 cycles, right? So being able to issue activate commands every 4 cycles is neat, but it doesn't allow you to send a read command any sooner, right? Because your read commands are limited by the actual burst length, and your write commands are limited by burst length. So this being lower than the burst length allows the memory controller to potentially shove activate commands into, like, in between other commands more densely, but it doesn't directly allow you to send more read or write commands, right? Which, at the end of the day, all we're ever really doing with memory is reading or writing from it. So, or to it, I guess. But, you know, so this does help performance, because the memory controller can get a bit more creative with, like, how the commands are sent, but it doesn't do that much. So it's kind of neat, but it's not, like, massively... Like, I would rather have a low TRC than a TRRDL of 4, is the best way to put it. Or a lower TRFC. I'd happily trade TRFC for TRRDL if I could, but that's not how memory overclocking works. So TRRDL goes low and TRFC's on auto, because you lower it by 50 and it stops being stable. Anyway, then we have WTRL. I did not minimize this. This might go below 20. I don't think it'll go significantly below 20, so, yeah, if you have Samsung DIMMs and you feel like spending more time on it, you can experiment with if that timing will go lower. I do think I tried 4 for WTRS, and that I don't think worked. Because, yeah, I tried to punch in, like, Hynix-style tertiaries, or, well, secondaries and tertiaries, and it did not like that. TRRD-SCL is at 4. I didn't check if it would go any lower than that. It might, but probably won't. Like, well, if it goes any lower than this, that would actually be like better than what Hynix chips do, and off the top of my head, that shouldn't be possible with Samsung chips. And we have WRWRSCL at 4 as well. I'm actually surprised that this did 4. I did not test lower than this, but write commands aren't like super important to performance, because if you think about it, generally the CPU is most limited by the memory when it's trying to read something, right? You can just kind of delay write operations to whenever. They're not that important. Read operations, on the other hand, tend to be somewhat latency sensitive. Anyway, oh, and then for the SC timings, those are at 1. They don't go any lower than that. That's the minimum value for those. The same DIMM and different DIMM timings aren't relevant because this is a single rank memory configuration. Then we have TWRRD at 4. Oh, okay. Actually, I think I did test WTRS at 16, and WTRL at 16, and that didn't work. But yeah, TWRD at 4. This might go lower than this. I didn't check. I'm not, well, I don't think it's not like it's going to hit 1, but it might do 2. And TRDWR is at 16. I didn't check if this will go any lower either. But this is basically my Hynix tertiaries at this point. Like 4.1, 4.1, 4.16. Actually, I think the Hynix is usually 2.16, but whatever. Well, with Hynix, I would normally go like 4.1, 2.1, 2.16, I think. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the timings. I didn't adjust anything else. Arguably, messing with these might be able to fix the, like, issue with booting at high voltages, but it could also be some other bug with the BIOS or something. I'm really not sure why the, like, Gigabyte boards will, like, on certain BIOS versions, you set high VDD voltage, and the board just goes 15C5 and doesn't post. So, yeah. Anyway, like, the funny thing is, because the AMD memory control, like, you kind of have less memory timings than you have on Intel memory controllers, and some of them are, like, restricted to just really high values. Like, you can't set TWR below 48. The Samsung memory chips are actually not completely terrible. Really, the biggest weakness is, like, the TRFC not going any lower than auto. Or, well, I don't know, maybe 800 would work, but 800 and 824 are functionally the same thing, as far as I'm concerned, so that doesn't count. But yeah, so, like, the biggest weakness is, like, TRFC doesn't go very low, TRC doesn't go low, and then you otherwise have, like, actually pretty solid timings with Samsung memory chips, so that's kind of neat. The end result is that they have actually really, like, solid, like, latency performance. Because, like, your primary timings are super low, but they're not as good in, like, sustained heavy load. So, yeah. Anyway, that's basically it for this video. So, yeah, I think I might do a bit more testing on pushing the memory timings a bit lower. The issue is like, I guess I should take notes of what I tried. I am relatively certain that I tried this. This. And that did not work. Because if it did work, it would still be here. But, well, I definitely didn't try 18. Because, again, like, if you're tuning timings, like, you might be tempted to tune them by 1 tick at a time. But, like, 1 tick at a time on any, like, 1 tick of any given timing does not make that much of a difference. So you're wasting your time doing that. Like, I generally use pretty substantial steps for lowering timings because small steps are just, like, especially, well, yeah, like, unless you're trying to push benchmark scores, in my opinion, total waste of time because it takes forever, right? If you're going to do things that way. So, yeah. Anyway, oh, I guess I could, yeah, basically I could maybe mess around with trying to lower the TRAS and TRC a little bit. It's worth noting that, at least in theory, having a TRAS and TRP that is, like, added up together that is less than the TRC value shouldn't do anything. Because the TRC controls the... oh, well... So TRAS controls the delay between your activate command and your precharge command, whereas TRC basically limits the delay between it limits how soon the activate after the precharge can come, right? So TRAS controls activate to precharge, TRC controls activate, precharge, activate. And so the thing is, if your TRC and like TRP controls the delay from precharge to activate. So if your precharge to activate and your activate to if your activate to precharge and precharge to activate are less than your activate to activate timing, they don't really do anything. Or at least the TRAS part of that doesn't really do anything, because what's going to happen is you're going to go activate and you're going to send a really quick precharge potentially, and then you're just going to sit there and wait because of the TRC timing. So like having super low TRAS with a really high TRC is pretty pointless, because you can't, like, your activate commands are being controlled by the TRC timing. Now, having low TRP is always a good idea, because you might precharge like whenever, right? Like precharge is something you might do after a single read, you might do something like activate read precharge or activate write precharge, but you could also do an activate and then like 100 reads and then precharge. So precharge being low is generally a good idea. TRP being low is generally a good idea. The precharge itself, like, you're not actually changing the length of the precharge itself, you're just shortening the amount of time that the precharge is allowed to take place in. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of it for Samsung memory chips. And I gotta say, overall, I am a lot less disappointed with them than I thought I would be when I first went into this. I would argue a big part of that is the 2166 Infinity Fabric clock. I kind of want to mess around with what I could do with Hynix sticks now with, like, this kind of Infinity Fabric clock. And it's also worth noting on Ryzen that, generally speaking, say 6200 with lower Infinity Fabric clock is actually better, both in terms of memory latency and just overall, like, memory bandwidth. Because, yeah, the Infinity Fabric clock has just somewhat less impact on the overall memory performance than the memory multiplier itself. At the same time, though, pushing the memory multiplier, or pushing the memory clock, generally requires a lot of SoC voltage, depending on how good your CPU is, whereas pushing the Infinity Fabric clock doesn't. So if you want, like, a low SoC overclock, low SoC voltage overclock, you kind of want to stick to, like, DDR5 6000. If your CPU is good, you might be able to do even 6200 at like 1.2, 1.25. But yeah, if your CPU's memory controller sucks, then you might need, like, north of 1.3 volts to do 6200, and then you're kind of screwed. So yeah, and so in that scenario, the Samsung memory chips kind of, lose their main disadvantage of just not clocking very well, because everything, like, they hit 6000 just fine. Honestly, I'm really surprised that, considering the primary timings these do, that there aren't, like, XMP memory kits and, like, Expo memory kits for Samsung memory chips that are, like, 6034, right? Because there is, like, G.Skill has a 6036, 36, 36 bin. Like, I'm surprised that there isn't, like, a 3034, because it would be so easy to do with Samsung memory chips. You just put, like, 1.4 volts into them, and I'm relatively certain that it would be a very easy to do XMP profile. And the funny thing is, for an XMP that would actually be, like, in the XMP configuration, that would actually deliver pretty solid performance. Because Expo profiles and XMP profiles, they're both limited to a very, like, they can't set all of the timings. They just set a very short couple of them. And so having super low primaries as an XMP or an Expo would actually make, like, it wouldn't, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't change the performance that much, but it would have more, like, it would be, better than the usual, like, really loose primaries that you see with a lot of Hynix kits. Not by a big margin, right? Because like you can get Hynix in like 3238, so like the equivalent, or you can actually get like 3038, and I think G.Skill now has a 3036 bin. But you could have Samsung in like a 3034, and it would have like I don't think it's even like 1 nanosecond, but it's like like it would be like a fraction of a nanosecond lower latency basically. That's actually it would be like a fraction of a nanosecond lower latency. From just having like slightly tighter primary timings. But yeah, anyway, well, this video went way longer than necessary, but I think at this point everybody's used to that with this channel. So yeah, that's Samsung DDR5 with Ryzen. It's viable. It's very viable. You know, like I'm not even sure. Like it's almost good enough that I would say like if you have like the choice between a Samsung and a Hynix kit and they're like the same price, actually no, I think I'd still take if there's the same price, I'd take the Hynix kit. But if the Samsung is like significantly cheaper, I would potentially consider the Samsung kit. Yeah. I would like strongly consider the Samsung kit if it was like I don't know, $30 cheaper or something. Which would be kind of insane because that would be like a $70 DDR5 memory kit. But actually, I think you can already find some Hynix kits at that, like, or approaching that price point. So, yeah, like that I think is the main argument against Samsung DDR5 is like it's not cheaper though, right? Like, yeah, it can perform pretty well, especially on Ryzen, but it's not that much cheaper, and that's the main issue. But yeah, if you can find a good deal on it, it's not bad. Or at least this Corsair kit isn't bad because I have heard like that apparently like the G.Skill 6000 36 kits are like flaky with compatibility. But I've not had one of those in like several months. So yeah. And this Corsair kit really hasn't given me any issues whatsoever. Like, I was really worried that it would be like a nightmare to stabilize at 6000, but honestly, 6000 works just fine. And I didn't even try to see if it, like, what it would take to do 6200, so, yeah, mostly in the interest of actually getting some content about Samsung DDR5 done, so here we are. Anyway, yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp. There's a link to that down in the description below as well. And yeah, that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.